Good morning. Thank you so very much for joining us in person and online. I'm Patrick Gaspard, Distinguished Senior Fellow here at the Center for American Progress, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our second installment of our Path Forward Speaker Series. It's beyond an honor to be able to welcome back to CAP Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland, who will be in conversation with my friend, the brilliant CEO and president of CAP, Neera Tanden. Senator Van Hollen is joining us in a moment when we're at a crossroads as a nation and as an ideal. It's a crossroad not simply of our partisan politics. Believe it or not, there are some things more essential than who wins the next election. This road intersects at our Constitution's Bill of Rights and our fundamental core values as a people. In this moment, at this crossroad, Senator Van Hollen has shown us that the great phrases of democracy carved into our halls will fail to retain their integrity if we're not seen to act to protect them, even when we're in the minority. Senator Van Hollen didn't rely on focus groups when he saw that people were being disappeared from our streets without even a fig leaf of due process. He went to a prison in El Salvador to advocate for a constituent because he heeded the warnings of James Madison to always act against the abridgment of freedom of the people by gradual and silent encroachments by those in power. Our senator declared that if you won't fight for the Constitution, you don't deserve to lead, precisely because he understands that we don't get to neatly pick and choose our strategic fights when the President of the United States is mauling our Constitution at the point of peril for the powerless. We're inspired by you, Senator Van Hollen, because of your defense of our rights, but most especially because you are insisting that we have to push forward with new principled solutions to challenges in education, in trade, in health, and in foreign policy. Please join me in welcoming Neera Tanden and Senator Chris Van Hollen, who labors every single day with the conviction that we're not just a country defined by our awesome power, we're a creed, and our strength must have a moral component to it. Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Patrick, for that phenomenal introduction. And we are excited to have Senator Van Hollen here for our second in a series on the Path Forward. The Path Forward is a series that's really dedicated to describing how we fight back in this moment, but also in that fight, how we think about the path. I think about the future and how we basically ensure that we have ideas and alternative agenda. So we'll get to both of those today. But first, I'd love for you to just talk to us about why you made the trip to El Salvador, what you found there, and why you thought it was so important to do what you did.
Sure. Well, first, Neera, thank you and Patrick and the whole team at the Center for American Progress. It's good to be with you. So I met with Kilmar Abrego Garcia's wife, who's shown there, with his mother, with his brother, and heard the story firsthand about how Kilmar Abrego Garcia was driving with his 5-year-old son, who has autism, when federal agents pulled up behind them, pulled the car to the side of the road, and essentially seized illegally Abrego Garcia. He went to Baltimore. He tried to make a phone call to let people know how he was. He was denied that opportunity. He was then taken to Texas. There he was handcuffed and shackled, put on a plane, not knowing where he was going. And next thing he knows, he ends up in CICOT, which is this notorious gulag of a prison in El Salvador. And that was around the same time that the president of El Salvador, Bukele, was coming and visiting the United States. He met with the president in the Oval Office. And so I wrote a letter to the ambassador to El Salvador here and said, I'd like to meet with Bukele when he's here to talk about, releasing Abrego Garcia, not being complicit in this scheme to undermine people's constitutional rights. He did not meet with me. And I said in my letter, if he didn't, I was going to go down to El Salvador. Both to see if Abrego Garcia was alive, but also to ask for his release at some point, immediately better, But all of this is in the frame of our constitutional rights to due process. I've been very clear, I'm not vouching for a person. I am vouching for his constitutional right to due process and making it very clear that if you allow President Trump to trample over his constitutional rights, you do threaten them for everybody in this room. Because what bullies do is they start by picking on people they think are most vulnerable, but they don't stop there. And this has been part of a pattern, of course, we're seeing from this president who recently was asked whether he had to comply with the Constitution
100%.
and said he doesn't know. And I'll just close with this, in this part. We have a 9-0 ruling from the Supreme Court ordering President Trump to facilitate the return of Abrego Garcia to the United States. And as we sit here, Donald Trump is thumbing his nose at the courts. Where it sits right now is it's gone back to a federal district court in Maryland. A judge has essentially ordered the administration to provide information about what they're doing to comply with that Supreme Court order. And so far, they've been stonewalling, and most recently claimed the State Secrets Act to try to prevent them from having to provide information. But this is a critical moment for this country because this case, and some others, but this is advanced more than most, this case really is a test about whether we're going to stand up for the Constitution. And in my view, it's never wrong to fight for the Constitution of the United States.
100%.
That's what makes us who we are.
So we will definitely get to the constitutional principles and actually the public support for those constitutional principles. But I wanted to just ask a few more questions about your trip. And essentially how you were shadowboxing the government and the kind of disinformation they tried to put out, which is a whole challenge here. So perhaps you've described it elsewhere, but I think it's good to give you an opportunity in full to describe what happened when you got there, how they tried to set the stage, because I do think this is an element of kind of authoritarian governments, which is to sow the seeds of disinformation.
Exactly, and you saw this happening both from the Trump administration as well as from Bukele and the El Salvadorians. On the US side, you just have this constant flood of information, disinformation on social media, trying to change the subject in this case, right? Trying to make it all about fighting gang violence. As I've said, we can fight gang violence without suspending the Constitution of the United States. And in fact, in this region, back in the early 2000s, I headed up an anti-gang regional task force. But we should not just let them spew this information and change the subject. The judge in this case has said very clearly that the administration has provided, quote, no evidence linking Abrego Garcia to MS-13 or any other terrorist activity, end of quote. So my response to them on the social media side and the information is put up or shut up in court, right? That's where people provide 100%. Testimony under oath. Now, the government of El Salvador has become complicit in this scheme. And essentially, they are being paid by the United States to take people like Abrego Garcia in violation of his constitutional rights. So when I showed up in El Salvador, I did meet with the vice president, okay? And I asked the vice president if I could meet with Abrego Garcia. He said no. I also asked for his release, and that's where he said, and I wrote to Donald Trump, President Trump, about this. He told me that, again, the only reason they were holding him was not because they had any charges against him. The government of El Salvador has no charges against him. They're holding him solely because they're being paid by the US government. And they are therefore complicit in this scheme. They then tried to, I then the next day when they refused to let me see him, I got in a car with some others, including the lawyer for his wife, Jennifer, and we tried to go to the prison, CCOT. And we were about a couple of kilometers away when they'd set up a checkpoint. And soldiers were there and waved the car to the side of the road. And we got out, we had a conversation. They said they'd been ordered not to let me proceed. Ordered not to let me proceed to see Abrego Garcia. I said, do you know how he's doing? They said, we don't know, we don't care. Essentially, we have our orders. So I went back to my hotel. I did a press conference with a lot of local press and made the point that El Salvador was violating international law because international law requires that prisoners at least have access to their lawyer or somebody in the outside world, and there've been nothing. Nothing before, and by the way, since I met, nothing since. So that, I think, raised the temperature in the country, and I got a phone call a little later that day, and that's when I was able to meet with them. They relented. They did try to set up, I'll talk about, they tried to make it look like a tropical paradise. They wanted us to meet by the pool, by the way. We said no. They then staged these, margaritas, which, the right-wing folks have just sort of taken hook, line, and sinker. It's a big lie, but the idea was to deceive people into thinking that, here was Abrego Garcia enjoying himself in a tropical paradise when he had just been, he'd been in the most notorious prison. So don't be deceived, but you've got a lot of misinformation going on to try to change the subject away from due process, Constitution.
Right, and just to say, until you met with him, no one, like his wife had not heard from him, right? You were the first person, because you went down there and met with him, that could actually ascertain that he was still alive and hadn't been tortured or anything. We've all seen the images that are actually real of the prison. It is scary and, not up to American standards by any means. So just talk a little bit about the fear of his wife.
Well, you're right. He hasn't been able to talk to her or his lawyers, either before my visit or since. I mean, I'm the only one who's had a conversation with him. He had no idea what was going on in the outside world regarding this case, like a 9-0 Supreme Court ruling. He got very emotional about his family, including his 5-year-old son, who, as I mentioned, had autism. And he was clearly, and I asked him, so he said he had been traumatized by this whole experience, both the seizure, but also being put in CCOT. Now, I did learn, and it was when I met with him, that he had been recently at that point, very recently at that point, moved to another prison in a different part of the country, but still subject to a total news blackout and still not able to communicate with anybody. And so I relayed to him, the support and love of his family. I told him what was happening in the United States. He got a special, smile on his face when I told him that his union brothers and sisters at the sheet metal workers union in Maryland were rallying for his support. He said, that doesn't surprise me. And so, but he was obviously happy to hear it. We talked for some time. I will say, just for those of you who want to know what the setting was, there were a lot of people around, right? And so you do always need to keep that in mind. There were people with video cameras. It was hard to know for sure what kind of audio they would pick up. So I do want to make that very clear. And as I said, the president's government agents were there, and they placed these, if you look at the first shots, it's just he and I with water and coffee. And then later on, they deposit these drinks designed to make it look like they're margaritas. His is, liquid is a little lower to make it look like he drank it. It was all part of a deception. And Bukele was one of the first to tweet that out. I said to all you Sherlock Holmes fans out there that they really screwed it up, because if you look at whatever it was, sugar or salt around the rim, there was no gap. So it was pretty clear no one had So for people who went to the lengths they did to stage this deception, they kind of blew it. But I think that this is an illustration of how the lengths to which both Bukele will go, but also the Trump administration will go, just to lie to people and try and change the subject.
So I think, what's fascinating about that, though, is despite all the disinformation and the fact that the administration still talks about him being in a gang without ever proving it, there hasn't been any public evidence, really. They're not proving it in court. There's a lot of accusations. Despite all of that, what I think is so important about this is that while they tried to create this sort of miasma of disinformation and, really attack the character of this person, the public has really seen through all of this in terms of the constitutional principle at stake, and really fundamentally, even just despite all the criticism, actually understanding very clearly that this is about a person who is accused of something, but it hasn't been proven. And I'd love for you to talk about that, and we can rattle through the polls where really 60% of Americans think that, he should be brought back. They don't even believe really that they don't believe the Trump administration's attacks related to gangs. A strong majority don't. And large majorities understand the concept of due process. But I would just love from your perspective, that the fact that people are seeing that, what do you attribute that to?
Well, I think at the end of the day, people have a gut sense that due process and freedom are important in America, right? These are not liberal ideas or conservative ideas. They're sort of fundamental American values that you don't get illegally abducted and sent away to a gulag without a hearing or due process, and that courts are the places that people have those rights respected and observed. So yeah, I like to separate these issues entirely, right? I mean, the Trump administration's put out a lot of information. Regardless of what you believe or don't believe, the reality is that everyone has their constitutional right to due process, and that's what Americans are getting. I mean, look at New Hampshire. Their motto is live free or die, right? I mean, this is sort of the American idea that government cannot use its power in a way that denies you your basic rights and freedom without due process. And when I went, I had no idea. I just, I said, this is wrong. Mm-hmm. This is a violation of the Constitution. This person, we need to find out if he's dead or alive. If I'd done a finger to the wind kind of thing, who knows But my view is just pursue what we understand to be fundamental to our country, and just go do it. And the good news is that people do get it. And it also is clear how desperate the Trump administration is to try and change the subject. And so we have to keep pushing back, because they know as long as we, when I say we, I mean we the people, I mean everybody, are focused on the Constitution and protecting due process, then we will win the argument, because that's the American argument. So we can't relent. They are going to keep spewing out stuff, and my answer to that every time is take it to the court, take it to the judge. That's where people resolve these questions of fact. But the overall principle is due process.
So I'd yes, please. I'd like to relate these two things, though, because it is absolutely the case that people are seeing, people understand this case in this framework of due process rights. And, I don't agree with them all the time, but Joe Rogan even made basically the simplest case for this, which is if the government can call this person a gang member and just take him into a gulag in El Salvador, that means that he could be labeled a gang member in the future. Other people could be labeled a gang member in the future. So that's an important principle. But you joined the debate by going to El Salvador. And I guess the question I have is, as we think about the path forward, there's a lot of things that the Trump administration is doing, but they don't garner public attention. And if we don't contest them, some of these principles will fall to the wayside, right? So I do think there's a connection between contesting the issue, making a clear case for the opposition so the public can see it. And, there was a big debate, honestly, about whether this was a distraction or a really substantive, important issue. And I think a lot of, quote unquote, Democratic strategists were surprised at the end of this, or during, after you went there, how people are seeing that. And is there a lesson there you would advise us to take away from, this experience where in the beginning people were like, oh, we can't talk about this, and then you go down, you make a clear and compelling case. It's all over cable news. It's not on every podcast, but it is on mainstream media, and yet the public sees the opposition and sees, basically sees the constitutional principle and takes an oppositional position to the president.
Yes, I think we do need to confront these outrages by the Trump administration in a clear way. You're absolutely right that there were people who said, don't do that, or don't go and don't have any attention focused on this issue because you're playing in the Trump, playing field. And my view is if we can cut through this and focus on the core issue here, which is the Constitution and due process, we can be successful. I didn't think about all that, I have to say. I didn't think about that before I went down. I just, my view was that this is trampling on this person's rights, that it does implicate the rights of everybody in the country. And we also want to find out if it's alive. So, but I do think that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. Of course, we're going to need to focus on core kitchen table economic issues, and we may talk about the tariffs later on that are just creating chaos despite their, claimed, big deals. This is costing the American people dearly, but that doesn't mean that we should not confront the Trump administration's outrages in these other areas. And if you actually were just to ignore what they're doing and give them free rein, that's what they want, right? They want to scare people into not focusing on people's rights. The same sort of issues going on with respect to First Amendment rights and students at these universities, right? Whether you agree or disagree with the speech, the Trump administration doesn't get to say, well, we support the First Amendment, but it's sort of a la carte. We're going to crack down on students and lock them up for speech that we don't like, and then invent or just sort of dredge up this 1950s McCarthy-era law to claim that Secretary Rubio has, the authority in this case to deem speech somehow a threat to the national security of the United States. I don't know if you all saw Ms. Osterrich's, press conference the other day. She was ordered released by a judge. But, for them to sort of try to argue that these individuals are threatening the foreign policy of the United States just shows how, which is a ridiculous theory. It's trying to change the subject. It's a ruse to, really go after people on First Amendment rights. But this is another area where nobody should be afraid to stand up, because the First Amendment is not something that belongs to the Trump administration to dictate how it applies. And you see, Marco Rubio drives me crazy, Neera. When he was a senator,
You could just end the sentence there.
Okay, all right. Let me just say, he used to say we should promote American, values of democracy and human rights and free speech around the world. And they're still lecturing some of our European friends while they're violating the First Amendment right here at home, locking people up literally for speech. So my point is that we cannot run away from these issues. And by the way, when we put it right clearly, the American people are with us.
100%. I'm going to ask one more question about this case, and then we'll move to a few other topics of the day, and then move to audience Q&A. But I think one thing that is fascinating about this moment, and you really just touched on it about the lectures to Europe, about protecting liberty, et cetera, is that in the first, 100+ days of this administration, we have seen really the largest scale government overreach into personal liberty rights of people. You just talked about First Amendment rights of individuals. Obviously, taking on due process rights for people. There are due process rights for citizens that have been rounded up, as well as people who are legally here. And so, and we'll get to the tariffs, but the tariffs are a large-scale determination by the federal government, by Donald Trump, basically on what we are paying for goods. So it used to be that conservatives would lecture liberals on, our First Amendment rights and due process of law and individual, all of which due process of law is really fundamentally about protecting our individual liberty, the liberty of everybody in the country from a government that could strip away our rights. The reason you have access to courts is just that there's a third party that's determining whether, basically whether the government is acting according to law. Without due process, any one of us, as you've said, are subject to an overreaching, perhaps authoritarian government. So that is why it's a baseline principle. But I just love, as you're walking the halls of the Congress or the Senate, and perhaps you think of a Ted Cruz podcast on individual liberty from a few years ago, I'd love to just understand how you see this moment in which the whole rhetoric around the basic constitutional principles have just been, lopsided. I mean, just reversed. We've always been around constitutional principles, but the other, a lot of Republicans have somehow gone silent on that.
They have. You're seeing this direct attack on freedom. You're seeing an assault by the President of the United States on all parts of our Constitution. And Republicans in Congress apparently have no bottom when it comes to what they're going to stand up and defend. So in addition to the attacks on due process, in addition to the attacks on the First Amendment, we're also seeing this huge attack on Article 1 powers, right? When you have Elon Musk go in there with a chainsaw and just mow down important public investments that benefit all Americans to try to rig the government for people like him, and in the process, just ignore the laws that Congress has passed, both appropriations laws, but also laws creating different federal agencies. That is a direct assault on the Constitution and the First Amendment. Now, a judge just the other day in California put a 2-week freeze on some of these changes they're proposing, saying, at least preliminarily, that, Congress needs to be part of this. But Republicans in Congress are AWOL. The other area on tariffs is the abuse of emergency economic powers, because the president has just shredded that, used them for his own purposes. And yet when we had a vote on that in the United States Senate, you had the Vice President of the United States come down and cast the tie-breaking vote to protect their unconstitutional actions. But the broad frame, you're absolutely right. I mean, Republicans are essentially throwing out the Constitution, including important constraints on, the executive. There's a reason we have a Constitution. We didn't want a king. We didn't want an authoritarian.
That is the basis of
that is the fundamental
corpus, due process.
That is the fundamental idea. And yet they are using government power illegally in extra legal ways to take these actions. And Republicans have been silent. And there is a question about, when, if ever, they will wake up and stand up. But so far, very sadly, and it's a scary moment for the country that they're not. And it's because bullying, in some cases, because bullying works. Some of them will quietly come and say, we're depending on the courts here. And I'm saying, well, you're right, the courts are doing a good job, but at the end of the day, this is going to be a test that could fall in your lap, too. And what bullies do is they try to divide people, and this is why, I applaud all the law firms and the universities that are standing up to this abuse of power by the Trump administration. And I think we should shame those who aren't, because
100%.
those who are cowering and cutting their separate deals with the Trump administration are undermining the basic architecture of our checks and balances. And that's what bullies do. And so all of us need to be together and standing up for bullies. That's what's happening. And the fact that Republicans, these are principles they used to claim to stand for, but no more. Not when they're afraid of a tweet from Donald Trump or Elon Musk or whatever it may be.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is an important aspect of this to just remember that there's these individual attacks, there's the due process attacks, but there is a whole strategy to go after institutions that I think they perceive as oppositional, universities, law firms, the media, unions, perhaps in the future, not-for-profits. So I think that's why it's also really important that every effort, when you stand up, creates friction, right?
Yes.
So I think a lot of people know, a lot of rumors about EOs coming out to target not-for-profits, target particular foundations. Harvard stands up. It does seem to create friction in the system. You stand up. These people see the big opposition and the fact that the country is really against the administration, not for the administration. It I think even gives more wind to the courts to be clearer about these things. So, in that whole dialogue about we have to choose our fights, I think this point is so central, which is ideas won't be contested if no one contests them.
Exactly.
Right? So
exactly.
You cannot foster a majority against Trump's actions if there are no leaders who are willing to stand up for those principles, right? And this, again, just to give everyone a month ago was this is his strongest arena. Everyone supports him on this. I was debating this on cable news. Everyone was like, this is an 80-20 issue. And it turns out it's not 80-20. It's actually, if anything, 80-20 the other side, but only because people stand up do we know that. Otherwise, who knows where we'd be. So I just want to give another round of applause to you.
Thank you.
For that.
Thank you.
And then, there are other things in the world, and you talked about walking and chewing gum. So I'd just love to get your sense of the deal that happened this morning with China and the tariffs, and how do you see that playing out?
Yeah. So first of all, the only people who are benefiting from this tariff chaos that Donald Trump has created are people who are playing the stock market, right? You see the swings in the stock market. The president even tweets out at one point, weeks ago, good time to sell or buy or whatever it was. Those are the only people who are benefiting. The rest of the country's getting hurt very badly. I hear from small businesses in Maryland that are hurting in terms of the supply chain costs. Then there are those who are facing the retaliatory tariffs from China. China is eating Donald Trump's lunch on this. So what happened was Donald Trump, not knowing what he's doing, goes out and puts these huge tariffs on, and China actually plays it pretty cool. And then Donald Trump essentially comes crawling back to China. They don't want to admit that. And so what do? They just negotiate, so far, this 90-day pause, and they reduce the tariffs significantly, but not to the bottom. So what did we gain? Nothing. What did we lose? Lots. The economy is still in turmoil. Look, we just celebrated Mother's Day yesterday, and when it comes to getting car seats for your kids or all sorts of other things, the prices are going through the roof. So the reality is when Donald Trump says he's winning, let's be clear, he is winning for himself and his family. What we do see going on is a kleptocracy, right? He's about to head out to the Middle East. Who was in the Middle East just a few weeks ago? His kids, cutting deals with the UAE, with Qatar, with the Saudis. So yes, Donald Trump is doing well, and the billionaires are doing well at everybody else's expense. I call this the great betrayal of the Trump administration. They claim that they were going to be out there helping working people or forgotten Americans. Well, the people they're taking care of are the people who were sitting right behind him when he was sworn in and inaugurated, people like Elon Musk. So yes, he is losing. But it'd be one thing if he was losing for himself personally. In fact, he's profiting himself, but he's losing for America.
Yeah. I mean, we're all still paying a 30% tariff or a 10% tariff, which, is equivalent to...
Plus the chaos, right? That's the zig and zag and the uncertainty of it all.
Yeah. Great. And then speaking of, essentially big cons, right now, the House is deliberating on a reconciliation package. They've put out policies to really gut healthcare, particularly in the Medicaid program, but not just the Medicaid program, Affordable Care Act exchange markets as well. CBO just did an analysis that almost 14 million people, 13.7 million people will lose their health care coverage that they have today if the Republican plan goes forward. Josh Hawley, a colleague of yours, just penned an op-ed attacking this idea of going after Medicaid and really made quite clear in the op-ed that this is the single largest redistribution from working class people to the wealthiest Americans. Just put in context of your framework how this application, what this would really mean.
So this Trump tax giveaway to the very wealthy, people like Elon Musk at the expense of everybody else, especially right now targeting the 14 million plus Americans on Medicaid, is the centerpiece of their great betrayal of America. And that is what Josh Hawley was sort of saying. And it's also why Donald Trump, whenever he talks about it, goes, I'm not going to cut Medicaid. But of course, what's happening right now in the House is that they are planning to cut Medicaid. And all of this is in service to these tax cuts for very wealthy people and big corporations. So we do need to focus on the harm being done to the very people that Donald Trump claimed during the campaign that he was going to stand up for. And he is essentially throwing them under the bus in favor of people like Elon Musk and others. So we just need to keep that front and center in front of the American people, what is happening. He's hurting them on the across-the-board tariff policy, and he's hurting them when it comes to the budget. And by the way, they will still, in this tax plan, leave a huge additional deficit and debt to the country. And in case anyone thinks that that is a freebie, it's not. Interest rates are going to be going up. People are going to be paying. You're going to be paying more in prices in terms of tariffs. You're also going to be paying higher interest rates if they blow a huge additional hole in the deficit, which is what they're doing, even if they do these outrageous Medicaid cuts. And again, just remind people, who is this for? It is for the billionaires. And we need to make it clear what's happening.
Great. Excellent. I think we have time for several questions, yes, we have time for several questions. There's questions from the audience, and then there's questions online. We will take both. We have a gigantic online presence as well. Why don't we go there? And if you could just identify yourself before you ask the question, and it's really important that it's a question, and a brief question, that would be great.
Sure. Thank you so very much for going. I'm Jean Stoke, and I'm with the Sisters of Mercy of the Americas, a congregation of Catholic nuns. I wonder if you could both share what you learned about the human rights conditions in El Salvador and your commentary on Stephen Miller's proposing that the administration could let go of habeas corpus for immigrants. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, let me start with the last one. It just shows what lengths this administration will go to. You have the president saying he doesn't know if he's bound by the Constitution, and you have Steve Miller, right, saying that they're considering suspending habeas corpus, suspending the Constitution in the United States of America, essentially declaring martial law in the United States of America. And that should be a wake-up call, right, to everybody, conservatives, liberals, everybody in the middle, about what is in their minds, at least Steve Miller's mind, and he seems to have an awful lot of influence on Donald Trump, okay? So that's one thing. There's a reason that Trump picked Bukele to be his partner in this. It's because you have seen this sort of great clampdown on human rights in El Salvador. Now, when I met with the vice president of El Salvador, I did make clear that we have common cause on one thing. We agree that we should be fighting gang violence, MS-13. I talked about the efforts that I led in this Washington region back in the early 2000s. But you can fight gang violence without trampling over human rights and essentially locking up people without their having any due process. That's what Donald Trump's trying to do here. That's what Bukele has done in El Salvador. And that's why you have CCOT being this sort of notorious prison. If you read the most recent State Department human rights report about prisons in El Salvador, they essentially talk about the very credible evidence of torture, and they go in at some length. This is the prison where you taxpayers, American taxpayers, are sending their money in order to participate in the scheme to deny people their due process rights. So Senator Kaine and I did file a resolution, 502B it's called, anyway, and it could come up on the Senate floor as early as this week. And essentially, it will give us an opportunity to have a discussion and a vote on the issues of due process of the Constitution here, but also highlight the lengths to which Bukele's government has gone in order to be complicit. I call it the cash for collusion scheme. Thank you.
And just like one point to add, what's so interesting about this discourse about their focus on gangs and smuggling is while they're have this rhetoric, the Department of Homeland Security has all this rhetoric about this case, they're also dismantling the international task force that has been set up over many administrations, but accelerated in the last one to actually use information sharing, intelligence gathering to go after drug smugglers, human traffickers, and MS-13.
Yes,
so
the transnational, gang violence effort.
Joint Task Force Alpha was basically set up as share information and intelligence across Latin America, the United States, Mexico, so that we had a better strategy to actually take down drugs, smugglers, human smugglers, drug smugglers, and the like. And so it is an odd thing that if you were really focused on the problem, you would at least not take down that task force. So I'm sorry, we have over here, please. We have a lot of questions, so we'll try and go quickly.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Marylander Goldsmith. I'm a constituent. Thank you for everything that you're doing.
Thank you.
I'm with Jewish Earth Alliance. And we, as grassroots activists, we're struggling with what to focus on in terms of the dismantling of all environmental laws going back to the Clean Air, the Clean Act. Richard Nixon signed those laws, and all of the things that we're trying to do in confronting climate change. And I'm wondering, what's your perspective on how we should focus our opposition in that area in these times?
Well, thank you for what you're doing. And you're right, you're seeing this all-out assault on important environmental protections, right, to help keep the air we breathe clean and the water we drink drinkable. And it's essentially a sellout to the big polluters. I mean, I say the most corrupt bargain in the last election was the fact that Elon Musk spent $260 million to elect Donald Trump, and Donald Trump handed the keys to the government over to Elon Musk. But the second most corrupt bargain was essentially when they were down at Mar-a-Lago, and Trump said to the big oil folks, hey, spend $1 billion and give me your wish list. Well, he's given them their wish list, and that's what you're seeing here in action. It's a giveaway to big polluters. My view, and I've introduced legislation to do it, is we should actually have polluters pay, because the American people shouldn't have to pay in terms of bad health and more taxpayer dollars for all of the environmental harm, including the impacts of climate change on themselves, on our communities. But they have the reverse idea, right? They want to reward the polluters, not ask the polluters to pay. They want all of us to pay. So I think, look, we just need to make sure that the public knows what's happening in terms of confronting them on these issues. There are lots of communities that, more people will die because there's going to be more toxic pollution, coming out of, particular facilities around the United States. So we do need to just really zero in on the health impacts of America and the cost that they're feeling. I mean, they're also talking about dismantling FEMA, which of course is the entity that's there to help people after these emergencies that are made more intense and frequent because of climate change. And at NOAA, where I happen to represent NOAA at Silver Spring, their whole theory is, if we don't collect the science, maybe it just won't happen, right? Let's just sort of put our heads in the sand and this thing will go away. It's another gift to the biggest polluters, because when people know more, then they want to do something about it, of course, to protect their health and to prevent them having to pay more taxpayer dollars for the impacts of climate change. So I do think it's another opportunity to focus. I will say right now in the House we have an issue where they're trying to strip away the California emissions alternative, and I'm not going to get into details here, but they're essentially talking about blowing the hole in the rules and overruling the parliamentarian in the United States Senate, again, on behalf of polluters. So moments we should focus on these things. Yeah.
We're going to go over here. And just while we're doing that, I'll offer one idea, which is the House is considering a range of ways to pull back on the climate investments we've made. The administration can be a little tough to influence, but House members should know that they're both hurting the environment and raising utility costs while they basically take away these investments. So that's an area just over the next several weeks, if we could really focus in on the attention on harming the environment, making our water and air less safe, and raising costs for American families, which is part of the middle class squeeze everyone's seeing. I think that's really important to focus as well.
Yeah, if I could build on that, because one of the things, and I meant to mention that, one of the things they're talking about stripping out is something that I introduced legislation on years ago, and working with the Biden administration, we finally passed it, which was essentially the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Reduction Fund. Originally, we called it the Green Bank back in the day, and this is very important investments in communities all over the country that will both help people reduce the costs of energy, make their homes and businesses more energy efficient, and directly address these fundamental questions. They've targeted that specifically. In fact, they originally, when the administration first came in, they manufactured some claims against the participants in the program, like legal accusations. The government lawyer in the case quit because they were essentially asking her to manufacture to lie, which is a really important issue. The other piece I want to mention is on wind energy specifically. When you shut down wind energy, which is what Trump, they say they want more energy. Well, if you want more energy, you don't shut down wind energy, which is especially offshore wind energy I'm talking about. They're trying to shut down offshore wind, which is important in Maryland, among other states. And that will drive up cost to everybody else, right? If you reduce the amount of energy from offshore wind being generated, you're going to just drive up costs to everybody else at a time when we're having more and more demand because of AI and because of data centers. So that is that's not only an environmental issue, it's a pocketbook issue. They're going to jack prices up just because they don't like offshore wind.
There's a question over here. Again, just identify yourself, please.
Thank you, Senator. My name is Neil Skinwani. I'm with African Communities Together, and I'm a community leader in your state, Maryland. My question is, for us immigrant communities, of course, the attacks by this administration are our biggest fear, but we are also worried about not having reliable allies and partners. So my question is, and we've seen that in your party from the Democratic side, we have seen like senators, leaders like yourself, Senator Cory Booker, really standing with and for the people. My question is, what do you think about your other colleagues? How committed are they to standing with and for the people like you're doing? And we sincerely appreciate all your efforts on behalf of our communities. Thank you again.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. So I think, and we talked a little bit about sort of the back and forth conversation among Democrats on this. I think as of now, the good news is, I think people recognize collectively, Democrats, that we need to be standing up for people's rights, and that what's happening, what the Trump administration is doing and all the misinformation they're putting out, that we need to cut through that, and we do need to stand with immigrants. And there's a larger conversation to be had with respect to immigration policy. The Trumpers try to make the Democratic Party out to be the open borders party. I've always started the conversation by saying, yes, we need to have secure borders, but we also need to be true to the idea of America that welcomes, people who come here and sort of invest in the American idea, which includes, by the way, supporting the Constitution of the United States. I pointed out the other day on the floor of the Senate that I don't think that this administration could pass the citizenship test.
Exactly.
Because one of the questions on the test is about the First Amendment, and it's right there. So we expect, new citizens of the United States to know about the First Amendment that these guys are shredding as we speak. But my point is, I think it's very important that we recognize America's sort of roll over history of being a place where people from all over the world can come, and if they embrace the Constitution and embrace the rights here, that has contributed so greatly to the success of our country. And in fact, one of the dangers right now is that this administration is driving people out, including a lot of talented sort of scientists at places like NIH. And China, they're just saying this is the greatest gift they've seen in a long time. Even our, European partners, you can't blame them. They're trying to recruit a lot of these, individuals. So, that draw of talent has been one of the things that has really contributed to our economic success, as well as our overall success as a country. And so we can't throw it away. And I'll just say, to watch the Trump administration apply what I call their global apartheid policy by providing sort of asylum or refugee status to some Afrikaners, white South Africans, while they shut everybody else out, is just an outrageous insult to the whole idea of our country and the whole idea of Dr. King, that at the end of the day, it's character that counts. And we have to call it out for what it is. It's an application of a global apartheid policy by the Trump administration.
Over here.
Thank you very much. This is really interesting. My name is Ann Plant. I'm a very recently retired government scientist. I'm a fellow, emeritus fellow of the National Institute of Standards and Technology. So we have this great Project 2025 that's been a pretty incredible blueprint. And I'm wondering, I'm hoping that you all can tell me that there is something similar going on for the other side that maybe is based on big D democratic principles, is maybe bipartisan, and really lays out a plan that the American people can see that isn't just an anti-Donald Trump plan, but a real plan of what people can depend on when an opposition gets elected, or why an opposition should get elected. Thank you.
I'm very glad you asked this question. In fact, we ran out of time. We were, I think, going to talk about some of these issues. But number one, I agree with you. I mean, we do need to make very clear to the country why the Trump policies are doing such harm to all of us. And of course, people are feeling it in their pocketbooks. But I do agree with you. We also need to provide an alternative to the country. And clearly in the last presidential election, I'm not going to go into the weeds and analyze it all, but clearly people did not see, especially a lot of working people did not see the Democratic Party as fighting for them. And so short answer to your question is yes, many of us are giving thought to these issues and not sort of inventing them, but building on core ideas and principles that we've stood for. I know CAP will be doing some work on that. I will say that there's one area where we have an immediate opportunity, in my view, to show a distinction, and that's on this battle over the Trump tax cuts for the very rich at the expense of everybody else. Now, I think Americans, intuitively, they don't like the idea of a big tax giveaway to the very wealthy, especially when people are being harmed, like people on Medicaid. But my view is we need to do more than just say it's a bad idea to provide tax cuts for the very wealthy. We need to provide relief, economic relief to working people. And so I am actually in the process, I told our caucus recently, of putting together an alternative. I intend to put this out soon. I hope it will be embraced by many of our colleagues, because if you look at the Trump tax plan, while the overwhelming benefits went to the very top and to big corporations, the reality is they did also increase the standard deduction, which does give other people, working people, some additional benefit. And if we get to December, end of December, and that disappears, then those families will see a tax increase. And so my view is not only should we prevent that from happening for those, but my view is for those working Americans to show that we respect their work and value it, unlike Donald Trump, is they actually should get a bigger tax cut than they currently have. And it's based in part on the standard of living. In other words, the median standard of living in the United States, you have that for single individuals, no kids, heads of households. But if you're just struggling to get by at the sort of standard of living for the country, in my view, you shouldn't have an additional burden of a federal tax liability. And my view, and I've introduced this part of the bill in the past, is we do need a millionaire surtax. We need a millionaire surtax in this country, and make sure that people who are working hard every day but just barely getting by but are federal taxpayers, that they get the relief. So it's one example of an immediate way we can show materially that we are standing for working Americans when the Trump folks are there for the billionaires.
And I should just answer to say that CAP is building an alternative agenda across a range of issues. And I do think from our perspective here at CAP that the Trump administration is really governing for a small, it's kind of still minority MAGA base, and that gives us an opportunity to put forward an agenda that captures a broad majority of the country, and that we have to, when you face an authoritarian threat, it is important to build a united front. So we have to welcome as many people, some of whom may have voted for the president and now recognize that there's a great betrayal. We have to, ensure that we have as many avenues into support for that alternative. So over the next year, we'll be putting out ideas across a whole range of issues, some tough, like immigration, others that are critical across the board, an economic program. So we look forward to working with Senator Van Hollen. And I think, really what weaves us together is it is really important that we do offer that alternative, but it is also vital that we demonstrate that we are contesting these basic principles, these attacks on basic values, so that people really do understand that at a time where they are very scared, there are leaders who are standing up, not just when it's easy, but when it's very hard. And that is why we are so grateful to have Senator Van Hollen, who was willing to, take the courageous act and not listen to all the Democratic pundits who are out there, and, as he said, do what was right for the Constitution and for this individual whose, essential due process rights are being stripped. And if they can strip his, they can strip any of ours. So I hope we all give a great round of applause for this incredible leader in the Senate.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. Thank you, Kat. Thank you.